A turnaround chord progression is a set of chords that within just a couple measures of music loops back around to where it starts. So these chord progressions are used all the time at the end of a song form to start the song back over. And the very simplest turnaround chord progression we might play would be a 1 chord, in this case C major, followed by a 5 chord, in this case G dominant 7. But we can add complexity from there. We might play a 1, 6, 2, 5, or add chord extensions, or some other simple chord substitutions, or even a tritone substitution. I'm going to explain everything I just did in 5 levels of difficulty. It'll get hard fast, but I'll be as clear as I can, so regardless of your current ability level, you'll come away with some new music theory ideas, and you'll also get a sense for what's fun about turnarounds. They're a blank slate on which you can create endless variations. Let's start with this most basic version, because if you understand how this works, the rest of these levels will make more sense. We're starting on a 1 chord, and we want to end up back on a 1 chord. The chord that leads most strongly to 1 in Western music is 5. Specifically here, a 5 dominant 7 chord. So that'll be G dominant 7. You can hear how strongly that creates a sense of tension and resolution, right? 1, 5, we want to hear 1. The strength of that 5-to-1 resolution is why the circle of fifths is so useful. You might have heard of the circle of fifths. It's a way of arranging all of the pitches in our 12-note chromatic scale so that each key is next to closely related keys. And one of the great things about the circle of fifths, if you follow it around counterclockwise, every single chord transition is that of a 5 chord resolving to a 1 chord. 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, and so on. So for our second level of difficulty, we're going to create the classic 1, 6, 2, 5 chord progression by just going a little bit further back in the circle of fifths. We're kind of working backward from where we want to end up. We want to resolve from 5 to 1, but before that, let's take a couple steps backwards in the circle of fifths. Let's go from G back to D, and then back to A. If we play A, and then D, and then G, and then C, we're just moving step by step around the circle of fifths. We call this circle of fifths root movement. And in this case, I've just played diatonic 7th chords. That is, the 7th chords that all belong in the key of C major. And moving around the circle of fifths like that, we get a really nice circular sounding chord progression. You can listen to it. Right? It sounds kind of inevitable that it's going to keep looping back around on itself. And that's actually one of the uses of turnaround chord progressions. They don't just happen at the end of song forms to start back over. They're often used as vamps. So like an introduction to a song. If you just need to fill time and you're an accompanist, say for a musical theater show, this is a great way to create a vamp. You can just play 1, 6, 2, 5, 1, 6, 2, 5. And you can do that forever, and it will make sense musically. Now, I know from experience, for most of you watching this video, the most difficult thing about what I just did is not understanding the theory of the 7th chords. It's finding the inversions of those 7th chord shapes quickly on the fly so that you can use them in real music. And if you want help with that challenge, the challenge of internalizing all these chord shapes we're talking about in a video like this, so that you can actually use them in your life as a musician, that's what I help people do with the Piano Fluency membership. So you should go to pianofluency.com, learn more about my membership if you want help with the kind of practice that you can do to really internalize these chord shapes. For level 3, we're going to start sounding a little more idiomatic. We're going to sound more like we actually belong in, say, a jazz context. And turnaround chord progressions are very frequently used in jazz music. A turnaround in a jazz song might sound like this. What I've done is add extensions. I've added ninths to these seventh chords. I've also turned the A chord into a dominant chord. A quick definition of a ninth, we've extended the analysis of the chord tones past the octave. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's where our ninth comes from in a C major 9. And I'm playing this classic rootless voicing in the right hand. There's actually no C in this voicing. I just have 7, 9, 3, 5 to play my C major 9. And I'm using the same kind of voicing for all of these other chords. The only other thing you need to know is this A dominant 7 flat 9. Why is it a dominant chord and why does it have a flat 9? Well, it's a dominant 7 chord because it's a secondary dominant. I'm actually turning it into a dominant 7 chord that doesn't make sense in the key of C, but it makes sense in the key of D minor. And D minor is the next chord in the progression. So our ear accepts this unexpected chord with all these black keys that doesn't belong in the key of C, because it does immediately resolve into a key where those notes make sense. And the reason I like to play a flat 9 on this kind of secondary dominant chord, first of all, it's really in the style. You hear it all over the place in jazz music, especially in a turnaround like this. But also, part of why it works for our ear is that flat 9 belongs in that key of D minor that we're headed towards in a way that the natural 9 would not. D minor, if we're using the natural minor, has a B flat in it. And so you can see that the flat 9 is a name for that B flat. You can also listen to how it sounds. It has a stronger downward pull into the top note of that D minor chord than it would if we played the natural 9. All right, we've already gotten pretty advanced, right? We're playing rootless voicings in the right hand. We're adding chord extensions. We've talked about secondary dominance. That's a lot of what you need to be able to come across something like a turnaround chord progression and make it sound like it belongs in a style like jazz. But let's have some more fun with it. Let's look at some other chord substitutions. And musicians and composers like to use these all over the place just to create variety and kind of make a chord progression like this their own. You can make it your own with these principles. The first thing I'm going to do is turn that C major 9 chord into an E minor 7 chord. And you notice I actually didn't have to change any of the notes in my right hand. That's because the rootless voicing for a C major 9 chord is identical to an inversion of an E minor 7 chord. And when you're a student drilling these shapes, you start by, at least the way that I like to teach, you first would learn all of your inversions of basic 7th chords and then move on to rootless voicings. And you have this fun moment where you realize that it's actually the same shapes you've already been drilling. There are so many things in learning music theory at the piano that are like that, where you get these little bonuses. You get to reuse shapes you've already drilled. And that's a real advantage of moving kind of progressively through harder and harder skills like this, because you realize that you're not reinventing the wheel every time you move to a new skill. So this E minor 7 shape is familiar, and we just used it as a C major 9 shape. But if we just change the root to E, now we have an E minor 7. And this is a very frequent chord substitution. You can substitute a 3 minor chord for the 1 chord because they share so many of the same notes. Another fun thing about substituting the 3 chord in the context of this 1-6-2-5 chord progression, if we go back to our circle of fifths, you notice that now, if we kept that E minor in place and played everything else about our level 3 chord progression, we've actually just moved even one step further back in the circle of fifths. So we now get even more circle of fifths root movement going from the E to the A and then on from there. Let's look at one other chord substitution I did. I went from E minor 7 to E flat diminished 7 before going to the D minor chord. This is a really, really common way to move from one chord to the next. Diminished 7 chords are super flexible in where they resolve. You can actually resolve from a diminished 7 chord in any direction. The root of the next chord can be down a half step, up a half step, or on the same note. But coming down from the half step above your arrival chord is a very, very common movement with diminished 7 chords. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm moving from E minor 7, then I'm coming from the half step above the D minor 7 chord with that diminished 7 to land on the D minor 7. I will say some diminished 7 chords are more common than others, and this one is really common functionally. This flat 3 diminished resolving to 2 minor 7 comes up all over the place in jazz music. Okay, one more level of difficulty. That's the one that sounded like this. You notice my left hand is now moving down in half steps, and I'm no longer using diminished 7 chords for that. I'm now using dominant 7 chords. If you move down in half steps, if you approach your arrival chord from the half step above and you play a dominant 7 chord, that is another way of thinking about a tritone substitution. Easiest to appreciate this looking at the substitution for the G dominant 7 chord, right? Instead of G dominant 7, I'm playing a form of a D flat dominant 7. And first, let's just play a basic D flat dominant 7. This chord is a tritone away from the chord we started with. So that's why it's called a tritone substitution. It's all the way on the other side of the circle of fifths. But in practice, if we look at the context around this chord, we're going to go D minor 7, G dominant 7, C major 7. If I throw in that D flat dominant 7, I think it's easier as a performer to just think about that as moving down in half steps, right? Instead of jumping around the circle of fifths with our roots, we're just moving stepwise down in half steps with the roots. And if we play a dominant 7 chord, we're getting that tritone substitution for the 5 chord. Briefly, the reason tritone substitutions work so well with dominant 7 chords is that they actually share the same 3rd and 7th, right? Here's the 3rd and 7th of a G dominant 7 chord. Here's the 3rd and 7th of a D flat dominant 7 chord. And if you invert them, look, it's the same 2 notes that we just had. So those notes, the 3rd and 7th of the chord, have a lot of the power harmonically in a dominant 7 chord. And because they're the same in these 2 chords, that's why they're often used interchangeably. So what I've done in this final example is use a tritone substitution, or I can think of it as moving that root note down in half steps for both the A dominant 7 chord that we had in level 3. Instead of doing this, I'm playing E flat dominant 7, and I'm playing it with this 13 rootless voicing shape. Then I'm moving from there to the normal 2 chord, and then here I'm playing D flat dominant 7, the tritone substitution for G7, as I explained already. But I'm playing this voicing, which is an altered voicing. So I have 3, 7, flat 13, sharp 9 in this voicing. And that makes for a really juicy sounding substitution for the 5 chord, which then resolves nicely to 1. And that's what we're trying to do with all of these. We're basically just trying to find a way to loop back around to 1. So you can come up with your own variations on turnaround chord progressions. Explore other places where you might put diminished 7 chords moving in half steps, other places you might put tritone substitutions. You can look for other simpler chord substitutions. And you can also experiment with just how much spice you want to add in, how much flavor with things like extensions or altered extensions. You can start with very, very simple chords that all belong in the key and then move on from there. And it's good to be sensitive to the musical context. If I were playing like a really old school musical theater show and I wanted to vamp, I might not do that as my vamp. I might be more likely to go, right? Use a little bit simpler, square, more traditional voicings, just because it matches more with the style. So a lot of times that will be your main consideration as a musician in what type of turnaround chord progression you want to use. I hope you can see why composers and songwriters and improvisers all have a lot of fun with this kind of chord progression because it's just 2 measures long, comes up all over the place if you're repeating a song form, and there's so much room for variation and creativity. So even just as an exercise for you, it's really fun to start experimenting with turnaround chord progressions and see how many different ways you can navigate through this very simple, basic progression. Let me know how far you were able to get into these 5 levels in the comments. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more piano education content. Thanks for watching the video. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency.